Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, it's one step forwards and another one back for airlines as their attempts to restore services are hit by quarantines and more spikes in the pandemic, prompting most in the industry to brace for an even longer wait for a return to normality. My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me as ever is my airline business colleague, Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, struggling through this period of the new norm or the temporary norm. I'm not quite sure what we're in. This has been a really testing period for airlines over the past few months or so, I guess.
Yeah, it was certainly airlines will be hoping that obviously this last results season isn't the new normal, because it obviously reflected the period April to June, the second quarter of the year, where we saw clearly in most cases that airlines, particularly in April and May, had their fleets largely grounded, so they weren't taking in revenue for forward bookings at that time, because we were obviously in a very bleak position in a lot of markets. So yeah, we've gone into the results season over the last few weeks, and they were as bleak as we thought they'd be. It's kind of, the discussion rarely goes beyond, well, they weren't quite as bad maybe as we expected. A lot of it's been about cash burn, about seeing how well airlines have coped with keeping their costs under control while having no revenue come in. And in some cases they've done better than others, but it is a pretty bleak picture overall, really.
It serves as a reminder of the scale of the losses, which is kind of easy to lose sight of when you're in the middle of the crisis, and also because large sums of money had already been mentioned. But we've been tracking the results over this period. We've also been working on our annual financial rankings review that we do of the previous year, which of course is a slightly almost moot point of how much money airlines made last year, which out of the top 100 airline groups, that'll be around $24 billion US dollars that the leading carriers would have made, and that obviously has been wiped out by this one quarter alone, comfortably wiped out. So it's an absolutely huge impact, and I think what really hit home for me is the scale to which revenues have been hit. I mean, it's obviously a kind of no-brainer. If you're not flying any passenger flights, you're not going to be bringing any revenue there. But when you see the levels of revenues that the majority of carriers have got there, which are down 80-90% in cases, it's absolutely huge. And just about every airline, there are some exceptions, especially those that have done well within cargo markets, but just about every airline has lost more money than they were able to generate, which means, if I got my maths right, that their costs are at least double. For most airlines, their costs were at least double what their the revenues they brought in during that quarter, which is not a sustainable way forward.
No, and obviously during that period, a lot of airlines were kind of scrambling to get their costs down, and it's worth bearing in mind that in some cases their costs will have been helped by government intervention, for example, whether it's a furlough scheme like in the UK, whether it's the CARE Act like in the US. So, for many airlines, this could have been bleaker. I mean, there has been a level of help, but obviously the flip side of that is that help is ebbing away as we go later into the year, and even though we're seeing an uptick in revenue into the third quarter, which we'll talk about in a bit, which isn't maybe quite as positive as we'd hoped. There are other considerations, that some of the safety net falls away as we go later into the year. But yeah, it really is the story of that cash burn, and as you say, you look down the list of what revenues were versus for a year ago. So you look at Delta, for example, during the quarter, revenue below 1.5 billion, whereas in 2019 period is more than 12.5. So as you say, across the board, you're kind of looking at revenue 10-20% maybe of the level seen last year. Cargo is an interesting one because there's a weird dynamic in that market where even though demand overall has fallen, there's still been a capacity crunch because particularly during that period where there would normally be so much belly capacity in passenger aircraft that wasn't flying. It kind of created this mismatch between capacity and demand, which has helped some carriers. So we've talked about carriers like Etihad, for example, who have been deploying their passenger aircraft onto cargo routes. Qatar, their near neighbours, have talked a lot about that as well, as have several other airlines. In many cases, that's kind of tinkering around the edges. We're not talking about clawing back much of that lost passenger revenue. And obviously, if you're flying a passenger aircraft with only cargo, there's only so far that can take you. But with low fuel prices and things like that, it's certainly been a factor. And there's a slight anomaly as well with the Korean carriers. So Korean Air, you've looked at as well, haven't you? Which did surprisingly well during the quarter.
Yes, it was slightly. No sooner had I written an article saying that every airline in the world had lost to report so far money. Korean immediately reported a profitable quarter, which is sort of extraordinary, and we've seen one or two other carriers in the region, the Taiwanese operators as well, where they really have thrown themselves into that freight world. They're already big. Korean's already a big freight operator, one of the biggest operators in the world, and certainly in relation to its passenger business. So, and they have taken sort of major steps and continue to take those steps in sort of serving that cargo market. I think there's one or two other potential factors there, especially with Korea. I think there's a relatively strong and sizable domestic market, and that's obviously going to be, when we look at traffic numbers across airports, for example, what we've seen is a number of the airports that are ranking highly in that second quarter have been those in places like Russia or Turkey and even Norway, which has a relatively significant domestic market. So, and I think that certainly was at play in South Korea as well. So there are some outliers there, but it's a pretty bleak picture. And I think for airlines, the messaging is really quite challenging. They are having to continue to flag high levels of losses, even with a pickup in the passenger business or a slight return in the passenger business. That is, financial fortunes are not going to change very quickly. So they are having to implement restructuring, they're having to seek support measures, all the whilst they're trying to encourage people that it's time to come back, and they're putting messages out there that they're raising capacity, adding more capacity out there, which would traditionally be a more positive message, but it's probably less so during this period.
Yeah, it's a very delicate balancing act, really, because like you say, the carriers, they're trying to right size for what I guess they're looking at going into 2021. But at the same time, we often talk about in the airline industry how it can be so vulnerable to factors outside its control. I mean, this is kind of like the ultimate example, really, where talking from Europe, where we just see, it feels like every day there's a government will make moves to cut off markets, indirectly through quarantine measures or advice not to travel in some cases. So, and I think a theme that is developing clearly as airlines come out of that bleak second quarter and kind of heading towards the end of the middle of the third quarter, is that things aren't really looking as positive as we'd hoped. There was kind of that the feeling in June was that finally we're flying again. In many cases we're adding capacity. We're hoping that in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, that we'd get at least part of that absolutely crucial summer season. I mean, as you've said, the second quarter is traditionally really important for carriers because many of them need to make their money during the warmer months of the year, where there'll be much more demand for travel across the board. And losing that second quarter was bad enough, but unfortunately now we're seeing a situation where in the third quarter things aren't quite as positive as we'd hoped, And that is very concerning. Ryanair have cut 20% of capacity and planned capacity in September and October, as an example. So obviously one of Europe's biggest carriers there, reflecting a new kind of reality that's emerging. So we knew the winter would be challenging, and it's looking even more so now. And those decisions, trying to right size the businesses through job cuts, keeping fleets, getting fleet sizes down, or deferring new aircraft, are all very based on assumptions that perhaps in many cases are already slightly out of date. So it is tough. There are, as you talked about, some areas where there is a bit more light at the end of the tunnel, but it's certainly proving to be very challenging at the moment.
And that sort of slower pickup and recovery has, I think, sort of not only dented confidence of airlines of the rebound for this year, but actually, we're seeing a more conservative outlook, I think, as to when passenger markets might return to the highs they were in 2019.
Yeah, so IATA again recently revised its forecast for that. So we're now looking at, they reckon that the overall demand will be back in 2024 rather than 2023. The key theme that's emerging, we've touched on before, is clearly that international long-haul travel is going to be the slowest to return. And again, I think that's an area where a lot of the uncertainty exists as well around corporate travel, because of the kind of cultural change we may be seeing, where people have become more used to working remotely and not necessarily interacting without travel. It's all, as with so many of these forecasts, we can't be sure how that will play out, but it seems a reasonable assumption that businesses might not be so keen to assign such big budgets to that type of travel, particularly even more so when we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So the international travel will be the slowest to come back. But that kind of longer comeback is very much now on the cards, I think. And it's baked in to an extent, because the industry has been right sizing to this new demand scenario. So even under the best case scenario, there isn't going to be the capacity in the market going into 2021 to get back to 2019 levels anyway, because airlines are smaller. They're expecting that demand to be down for some time. And another key theme, obviously, we talk about international slow. What IATA continue to talk about is domestic markets are where the comebacks are happening more strongly. And you touched on Asia, so Korea is one market, obviously China. Until relatively recently, I also mentioned that Vietnam, for example, its domestic market was virtually at 2019 levels. Obviously, there's been some developments with an outbreak in the country since, but certainly another key theme for airlines is this thing where if you've got a strong domestic market, you've certainly got more places to be assigning your aircraft, and seeing demand that is a bit more predictable, because at least you're not relying on more than one government that could possibly impose restrictions on your ability to fly, or the willingness of people to fly. So those themes are still playing out, but we're pushing back really when the recovery might happen.
So after the break, we'll look at one or two other factors which might have quite an impact on how quickly traffic will return in the rest of the year.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Airline Business Podcast by subscribing via your app of choice.
Well, one of the areas where action has been taken and had a significant effect for airlines was the relaxation around slot rules, which basically enabled airlines to suspend their services without any fear of losing the rights to operate those. And those were, that's been significant in terms of stopping what kind of term ghost flights, where you'd have airlines forced to operate a route with no passengers and no prospect of revenue, just to retain the slot. How regulators choose to continue that policy is going to have quite an effect over the next period, isn't it?
It is. So essentially, I think globally there are what IATA call slot-constrained airports, where obviously there is very high demand for travel into the airport, and in many cases that will be obviously most evident at the peak times when you want to get a good slot so that you can fly onward services or get the aircraft back to your base at a reasonable time. There are around 200 of those airports globally, but 100 of them, around 100, are under the European Commission's jurisdiction when it comes to slot regulations, and at the moment the European Commission has not said that there will be a waiver on slots during the coming winter season, and it's a big issue for the sector, I think, and there are very strong arguments on both sides. So from an airline point of view, I guess if you've worked for years and spent money, I guess, securing slots, and we're not just talking about the big hub carriers. So if you look at Heathrow and British Airways, obviously is a dominant player there, but smaller carriers flying in, not smaller carriers, but carriers who only have limited frequencies into Europe, maybe from Asia, for example, will have worked hard to get the right slot, and they may know, looking at the coming winter season, that they could only serve Heathrow realistically or economically 3 times a week when they currently have a daily slot, for example. So from their point of view, they would say, well, this is a kind of force majeure situation. We it's not really fair that we're either forced to fly 80% of those slots or lose them completely. So there's kind of that side of the argument that this could be unfair for the carriers. On the other side, of course, is we're going through a massive upheaval in the global airline industry, and that when you put these waivers in place, it kind of cements a status quo that if we have a winter waiver, that essentially means that carriers are guaranteed those slots for the 2021-22 winter season. So there is an argument, and airports, some airports will put this forward, that actually it may be better to allow some of this upheaval to happen naturally, and for that to bring opportunities for either other carriers or even new operators to break into the market. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but it is a really key thing that's playing out at the moment in the particularly in the European market, as I say.
And it will have quite an impact on, and you see different airlines jockeying for position and putting their view. So you have someone like Wizz Air, which has been very proactive and aggressive in stepping up resources rates and capacity. Probably the most aggressive in Europe. I'd suggest starting various new bases, of which the latest one they announced was at London Gatwick, very sought after airport, and of course they would be pressing the case, saying that they're ready to fill the gap, I guess.
That's the thing, Wizz, as you say, is a great example. It's just announced the Gatwick base, so it's kind of it's an example of a carrier that where it's clearly not in its interest that in many cases the traditional network carriers are able to hold on to slots at good times at busy what were or are likely to be busy airports, with no guarantee really, with so much uncertainty in the industry. It is obviously a big call to say that you can keep hold of those slots, and other jurisdictions have already announced that there will be a winter waiver. So in Asia, I think many of them have. I think Brazil's ANAC has agreed to one. So they are happening in the key markets, and it wouldn't be a surprise to see the European Commission follow suit. I think there's a general theme we're seeing, I think, when you look at the European market, where obviously a lot of the traditional carriers have required government bailouts or government help to get them through this period. And there may be a sense that, I guess, governments, the last thing after ploughing money into a carrier to keep them going, that clearly governments would probably see it in their interest for some of those key assets held by those carriers not to be kind of lost or thrown back into the pot for some upstart carrier to take, for example, when there's a lot at stake financially as well. So yeah, I think the EC decision, which IATA have said they needed really in August, because we're coming up to the point where carriers will traditionally hand back slots that they won't be using. So they want to be able to do that knowing, either that they do have the waiver in place, or that in doing so they will have lost them completely, because that's obviously a key strategic decision for many carriers. So it was something really to keep a close eye on, because if that waiver doesn't happen, I think we'll see, as you say, it can play out in many ways. We may see more carriers, unfortunately, having to fly ghost flights, but you'd hope, particularly in the era where we're worried more about environmental issues, you really don't want to see that happening, beyond the fact that it clearly, for airlines that are already struggling, very operating flights with no revenue is insanity in many ways. But those slots, a slot at Heathrow, for example, is millions and millions of pounds. So it's not a decision anyone's going to make lightly to just throw them away, clearly.
So those slot decisions, or the slot rules around it, are going to be a major factor. But I think we're already seeing network decisions being taken, which are starting to show, a consolidation around particular, which is what you kind of anticipate as the network cuts are coming. London's quite a clear example where you have, many airports serving the city, and it's not. And we saw EasyJet, as part of its cuts, it's decided to close its bases at Stansted and Southend, and focus at Luton and at Gatwick. And I think the slot decisions will play into that, but regardless of that, we are going to start to see opportunities come up, and sort of airlines are to some extent going to have to decide which markets they stay in.
Very much so, yeah. So these, if you talk to airports, one of the big concerns is around those smaller facilities and how they're going to suffer during this period. And nothing's changed in the sense that airlines want slots at the often the busiest airports, the ones with the best transport links, whatever, and where there are better onward connections, for example. There's the smaller facilities, maybe as shown by the EasyJet example, are likely to suffer. But at the same time, the opportunities may be opened up by that. That's the play. I think when you think about looking at the market now and thinking about, either entering it or attempting a very aggressive expansion, you can see the conditions for it, but at the same time, in a zero gravity world maybe, but at the same time, the realities of the uncertainties around the progression of the virus and the financial situation are obviously going to weigh on those decisions. So as much as we may see opportunities opening up, it's going to take a very brave business to dive into that. And obviously Wizz are an example, as you said, that are seeing this as an opportunity, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule. And I think a theme, as I just touched on, that is kind of maybe emerging, is that in many cases the industry is kind of retrenching more towards the bigger airports, and the network carriers, having had those government bailouts, are probably positioned to kind of survive the crisis in one shape or the other. And it's getting harder to be around the edges of that in some cases, particularly if you went into this crisis without the cash, the liquidity to see you through several months with either no or massively reduced revenue. So I think it's a theme we're going to be keeping a close eye on, but it's a difficult one to map at the moment, whether the opportunities are really as much as they appear to be there, whether they are realistic, I guess, is the question that will be answered going into 2021.
And you potentially have, something similar playing out in the US, where the CARES package, the big support program, which has helped US carriers through this crisis. But of course, that That runs out, I think, at the end of September, I think it is. Some of the restrictions that were attached to that were tied to that, will go with it. And including in that were levels of minimum service in terms of connectivity to smaller airports, smaller points in the US. Now, it's not clear yet. There have been reports around that American Airlines might be looking at cutting back some of those points into regional airports. Those sorts of decisions will again have a major network impact, I guess, for that market.
They will, yes. It's kind of as I say, it's an emerging theme really, where you're seeing this the smaller airports again, as you touched on the US. You know, we're going back to the results season. Obviously, as we touched on, there is an extent to which, as bleak as the second quarter was, there was a level of government help in that, and I think as we go towards the end of the year, that will start to fall away. And the US, as you say, the US CARES Act is a really good example of that, where, you know, there are reports of the US carriers flying routes because they are mandated to under the government assistance they've received, but they're flying them with incredibly low load factors. And as much as fuel costs are pretty low at the moment, which helps you maybe justify those services maybe in the name of accepting the wider advantages of the Act. I think once that Act is no longer available to help, we are likely to see, as you say, carriers cutting some of those routes, because, you know, we touched on before, the US carriers are talking about in the tens in percentage terms in terms of being smaller going into 2021, so cutting 30% of staff, fleets being grounded for longer. So, naturally, I think we're likely to see some of those smaller airports where the routes aren't particularly lucrative at the best of times, that they will go, and that the impact we may see there could be obviously in the US market. A lot of those routes will be served by regional carriers that fly under the liveries of the majors, for example. That could be a particular challenge for them. So it's another factor really playing into looking ahead to the winter season in the Northern Hemisphere, the challenges that are ahead really, when we know, as at the best of times, a lot of airlines will take it on the chin that they'll report an operating loss during some of the slower periods of the year, but that is so much more significant now going into the coming winter season, that I think there's a lot to play out still, I think.
Plenty to play out, so we'll keep our eyes on that coming forward. That's all for this time. You can find links to the stories we've referenced, including detailed analysis of the airline losses across the second quarter, in the podcast notes. And you can keep up to date with all the latest on how airlines are dealing with the crisis at flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. And we'll see you again next time.